The black night broke open over the mountains, and the rain came down like something with a grudge. It had begun near dusk as a thin, cold drizzle, and Aloan Hart had told herself it would pass before the ridge road turned to Elder's Crossing. She had told her daughter the same, in the soft, sure voice a mother keeps in her chest for exactly these moments. But the mountains do not bargain, and by full dark the drizzle had become a downpour, and the downpour a roar that filled the whole ravine. She sat hunched on the buckboard with the reins wound twice around her raw hands, her threadbare blue shawl pasted to her shoulders, her chestnut hair loosed in dark ropes across her face. The cold had stopped feeling like cold some miles back. Now it was only a heavy, aching numbness. The horse, a patient gray gelding named Duff that had belonged to her husband before the fever took him, walked with his head low, picking each step as though he did not trust the ground, and Aloan did not trust it either. "Mama," came a thin voice from behind her, from the canvas where she had bundled her daughter into every blanket they owned. "The water's so loud. I know, sweet pea." Aloan turned her head just enough to be heard. "It's only the rain making a fuss. It'll blow itself out, and then we'll find some place warm and dry, and I'll make you a supper of anything you like." "Even honey cake?" "Even honey cake," Aloan said, and was surprised her voice held. 5 years old, and the child could still find honey cake at the bottom of a night like this. That was a gift, and she meant to see it kept. They came down the last of the grade toward the crossing, and Aloan felt the change in the road before she saw it. The wagon began to slew, the wheels no longer biting but sliding, and the sound of the creek was suddenly enormous and everywhere. A low, continuous thunder she felt in her teeth. She hauled Duff to a halt and lifted her lantern high, and the small yellow light showed her a thing that stopped the breath in her throat. Elder's Crossing was gone. Where the shallow ford should have been there was now a churning black river, swollen far past its banks, carrying whole branches and pale tumbling logs, all of it moving with a speed that made her dizzy. The water had swallowed the low willows and was still climbing, the near bank collapsing into the current one slide of earth after another. The far bank, where the road climbed into the pines in safety, might as well have been across an ocean. "We'll wait," Aloan said aloud, to Duff, to herself. "We'll wait for it to go down." But even as she said it, the wagon shuddered, and she understood they had already come too far. The road behind them was a slope of running mud. The road before them was a river. And the ground beneath them was not ground anymore, but a saturated, dissolving thing, and the flood was reaching for the wheels. She snapped the reins. "Back, Duff, back now. Come on." The gelding threw his weight against the collar, and the wagon lurched backward perhaps a foot before the near rear wheel found the soft edge of the drowned bank and dropped. It went down fast, the whole wagon canting hard to the left, and from inside the canvas came a short, high scream. "Posy, hold on to something. Hold on tight." The gelding heaved again, panicked now, and Aloan felt the crack come up through the frame into the soles of her feet, a deep splitting report like a rifle in a closed room. The rear axle had cracked clean through, and the wheel that had dropped was not coming out again, and now the black water was coming over the sunken side of the wagon bed in a cold sheet, pouring in among the blankets and the crates and her daughter. Aloan did not think. She was over the seat and into the wagon bed with the water at her shins, hauling Posy up out of the soaked bedding by the shoulders of her little coat. The child was rigid, mouth open, the red knit cap askew. The rag doll clutched so hard against her chest that her knuckles had gone white. Her wide brown eyes found her mother's face and held there as though it were the last solid thing in the world. "I've got you," Aloan said, close so the child could hear it over the roar. "I've got you. I have you. I'm not letting go. Do you hear me? I will not let go of you." "The water came inside," Posey said, in a small, stunned voice. "I know it did. It's all right." She was lying and knew it and did it anyway, because it was the only thing left to give. She pulled Posey up onto the high side of the tilted seat, wedged her against the rail, and put the child's small hands on the wood. "You hold here, and you don't let go, and you don't move, no matter what. Can you be my brave girl?" Posey's chin trembled, but she nodded, and she gripped the rail, and Aloan loved her so fiercely in that instant that it hurt worse than the cold. The wagon groaned and settled deeper. Duff was screaming now, that terrible ratcheting sound a horse makes when it is past fear thrashing in the traces, and Aloan made a swift, hard decision and reached down along the drowned side to loose the buckles she could reach, because whatever came, she would not let the animal drown tangled in the harness of a wagon already lost. The water bit her arms to the bone. Her fingers found the tongue of a buckle, worked it free. The near trace came loose, and Duff surged, half swimming, half climbing up the sliding bank and away into the dark, and she let him go. Then it was only the two of them, and the wagon and the rising black flood. She could not carry Posey across that water. She knew it the way she knew her own name. A grown man might not cross it and live. A woman her size with a 5-year-old in her arms would be off her feet and gone in 3 steps, both of them, and no one would ever find where the mountain had put them, and she could not stay, because the wagon was going, tilting further with each surge, and when it went over it, would take the high seat down with it. So Aloan Hart did the only thing left to do. She took up the lantern, a battered tin thing with a bale handle, the flame inside small and guttering and stubborn against the wet. She lifted it as high as her arm would reach, out into the streaming dark, and she began to swing it, side to side, a slow, deliberate arc, the way you signal to anyone, anywhere, in any language. Here, here, we are here, and we are in need. Hello. She screamed into the roar, though she could not hear her own voice. Is anyone there? Please, is anyone there? There was only the water and the rain and the mountain, black upon black upon black. But she swung the light anyway, because to stop was to admit there was no one to see it, and she was not ready to admit that. Not with her daughter's hands white-knuckled on the rail beside her. She would swing this small, stubborn flame until her arm gave out, and then swing it with the other, because Aloan Hart had never been a woman who quit while there was still one thing left to try. High above the ravine, on a porch he had built board by board, Silas Crane had been standing in the dark for the better part of an hour, watching the storm work. He had lit no lamp inside. He stood in the black with his shoulder against the doorframe, and his old brown hound Bramble pressed warm against his shin, and he listened to his creak, the little nameless creak he could ordinarily step across without wetting his boots, turn into something with a voice. He knew that voice. He had lived above this ravine 11 years, alone all of them, and he did not like the sound it was making tonight. It was a hunting sound. It was the sound of water that had found more water and meant to keep it. Silas was a big man, tall and heavy through the shoulders from a life of splitting his own wood and asking no help of anyone, with weathered hands and quiet gray eyes set deep under a heavy brow. A long pale scar ran down the left side of his face, from the corner of his eye down along the line of his jaw. An old scar, a story he did not tell, a thing that made men in town go careful around him, and made him prefer the mountain to the town. He was not a hard man, but he had learned to look like one. And 11 years alone had worn the looking so deep he had half forgotten there was anything underneath. He was thinking about going in when he saw the light. Far below him, down the ravine at the place he knew was the crossing, where no light had any business being. A small yellow spark, dim and smeared through the rain. He almost took it for a trick of his tired eyes. But then it moved. It swung, side to side, a slow, deliberate human arc, and Silas Crane felt something go still and cold and certain in the center of his chest. Because he knew that motion, and he knew there was only one reason a person swung a light like that in the middle of a flood. Somebody was down there, calling for help, and there was no one else on the whole Black Mountain to hear it but him. He did not waste breath on words. He was already turning back into the dark cabin, and Bramble scrambled up with a low whine and followed at his heel. Silas crossed the single room by feel, by 11 years of knowing exactly where everything was. His hand closed on the coil of good hemp rope on its peg by the door and slung it across his chest. He took his own lantern and lit it with a splint from the banked fire, his big hands steady. He pulled his oilskin coat from its nail, though he knew it would be soaked through inside a minute and knew it did not matter. "Stay," he told the hound, and the old dog followed him to the doorsill and stopped there, whining. At the edge of the world it was permitted. He went out into the storm. The rain hit him like a thrown bucket. The wind tried to take the lantern, and he cupped a hand around the glass and bent his head, and went down the path he had cut himself down the side of the ravine, the path he could walk blind. It was a churn of running mud now, and twice his boots went out from under him, and he caught himself against the wet rock, and kept the light up and kept going. Below him the roar grew until it swallowed the world. The swinging spark steadied and swung, and he fixed his eyes on it and thought, without knowing he thought it in words. "Hold on. Whoever you are, I'm coming." He came down the last of the path onto the crumbling edge of the river, and in the smeared light of his lantern and theirs he saw them at last. The broken wagon canted over into the black water, half drowned already, and clinging to the high side of it 2 shapes, one large and one very small. A woman with her lantern lifted and her soaked hair whipping across her face, and beside her, wedged against the rail, with both little hands, a child in a red cap. The woman saw him. He watched the desperate mechanical swing of her arm falter and stop as she understood that the light coming down the ravine was not lightning, was not a dream, was a man, was help waiting toward her out of the dark. Even over all that water he saw her mouth open. He could not hear the word, but he knew what it was. Silas uncoiled the rope, drove one end down over a root-fast stump on the high ground, and threw 2 fast hitches he could have tied in his sleep, tested it once with his full weight, and then, holding his lantern high and the loose end wrapped twice around his fist, he stepped down off the ruined bank and into the roaring flood. The cold of it took his breath like a fist to the ribs. The current grabbed his legs and shoved, and he set his boots against the drowned gravel and leaned into it and did not fall. The water climbed his thighs, his waist. Ahead of him a woman and her daughter held to the last dry corner of a sinking wagon and watched him come. And behind him the rope went taut and true, anchored to the mountain and to his own 2 hands. When he reached them he took the child first, prying her small hands gently from the rail and folding her against his chest, and Eloan let him, because there was nothing else to do, and because his voice, when he said, "I'll come back for you," I swear it was a thing she found she could believe. Posey weighed almost nothing against him. A small, cold bundle of soaked wool and trembling limbs, gone silent in that way frightened children do when fear outgrows crying. One of her hands had found the collar of his shirt and closed on it as if the fabric were the only solid thing left. "Almost there now," Silas said. "Low. You hold on to me. That's all you need to do." He kept his eyes on the slope above, where his own lantern hung from the porch post and threw a long yellow smear across the wet grass. He climbed. The girl shivered against him in long rolling waves, and he curved his body over her the best he could, until the porch boards took his weight with a familiar groan. He shouldered the door open, and the warmth of the room met them like a wall, close and dim and smelling of wood smoke and pine pitch, and the old dog smell of a house lived in alone. He knelt at the fire and settled the child into the big chair beside the hearth, so small in it that the chair seemed to swallow her. He drew the folded blanket down and wrapped it around her, tucking it at her chin, brisk and gentle. "Your mama's coming. I'm going right back down for her. You stay here where it's warm. Bramble'll keep you company. He's a good old fellow." The hound rose stiffly and crossed the plank floor and lay down again at the foot of the chair with a heavy sigh, his chin settling near the child's dangling feet. Posey looked at the dog for a long moment, and something in her small, rigid body eased by the smallest measure. Silas set 2 more logs on the fire so it would climb while he was gone, and went back out into the storm. The second trip was the harder one, and he had known it would be. Aloan was where he had left her, standing knee-deep in the flood with one hand still gripping the ruined wheel as though it might yet be saved. She had not moved to save herself. She had stood there watching him carry her daughter up the dark slope to a stranger's cabin, and every fear a mother could hold was written plain across her face when he came sliding back down to her. "She's warm," Silas said before anything else, pitching his voice under the roar. "She's by my fire, wrapped in a blanket, and my old dog's lying at her feet. She's not hurt. She's just waiting on you." Aloan's mouth worked. "I can walk. I can manage. Water's near to your waist and running fast," he answered, not unkindly. "It'll take your feet out from under you before you make 10 steps. Let me carry you. It's the sensible thing. Nothing more than that." Still she hesitated, and he understood the hesitation and did not resent it. A woman alone in the black of night, a scarred stranger the size of a barn door asking to take her up in his arms, so he did not reach for her. He stood there in the flood with the rain sheeting off his hat and waited, letting her weigh him, giving her the choice he could as easily have taken. "My daughter," she said finally. "Posey," he said, and saw the surprise flicker across her face that he'd caught the name. "She told me, up at the wagon, before she got too cold to talk. She's got a doll with a blue dress and half its stitching gone. She's fine. I give you my word, and my word's about the only thing I've got worth giving." Something in the plain, flat honesty of it reached her where softer words might not have. She let go of the wheel. She turned to him, and he bent and took her up as carefully as he had taken the child, one arm beneath her knees and one across her back, and she held herself stiff against him at first, her hands folded tight at her own breast rather than around his neck. "Put your arm round my shoulder if you like," he said. "Easier on us both. But suit yourself. I've got you either way." After a moment, she did. Her cold hand came up and rested lightly at the back of his shoulder, a small seated trust, and he felt the weight of it and said nothing about it. He turned and began the climb. The water dragged at his legs, and twice a submerged stone rolled under him, and he had to plant himself and find his balance with her held safe above the current. But he did not fall, and by slow degrees the flood fell away behind them, and the grass took its place. And then the porch, and then the warmth. Posy sat up straight in the big chair the instant the door opened. "Mama, I'm here, baby, I'm here." And Silas set the mother down gently in the middle of the floor and stepped back, 3 full steps, taking his hands off her and putting the width of the room between them so that she could go to her child without a stranger's shadow falling over the reunion. Eloan crossed to the chair and gathered her daughter up, blanket and doll and all, and knelt there on the hearthstone rocking her. And the 2 of them held on to each other and shook. And Silas turned away to give them the privacy of it and busied himself at the fire. He built it up until it roared. He hung the black kettle on the iron crane and set water to heat, and from the shelf he took a crock of broth he'd cooked down 2 days past, venison and root vegetables and barley, and spooned a portion into a smaller pot to warm. He worked with his back half turned, giving them room, but he heard the child's shivering breath begin to steady, and the mother murmuring the small wordless comforts that mothers murmur, and after a while he heard her draw a long breath and let it go, and knew the worst of the fear had crested and begun to recede. "There's dry things," he said, when he judged the moment right, still not turning fully round. "In the chest by the wall yonder. A shirt of mine, wool, too big for either of you, but it's warm and it's clean, and a quilt. You get her out of those wet clothes and into the dry shirt, and yourself as well if you've a mind, and I'll keep my eyes on this pot and my back to the room till you tell me otherwise. There's no lock on that door, but you've my word I won't turn round." He heard her rise, and the lid of the chest creak open. He kept his eyes fixed on the broth. Behind him came the small sounds of wet wool peeled away and dry cloth pulled on, the child's tired complaint, and the mother's hushing. He did not turn round. He would not have turned round for any wage on earth. "There," Eloan said at last, softly. "It's all right now." He turned. The child was swimming in the folds of his old gray shirt, the sleeves rolled into thick cuffs, the hem pooling around her like a nightgown, wrapped again in the blanket and set back in the chair, her damp fair hair combed back with her mother's fingers, and she looked warm and drowsy and safe. Eloan had wrapped the quilt around her own shoulders over her damp dress, unwilling to be caught out of her own clothes in a stranger's house, and he respected that too. Her chestnut hair she had wrung out and pushed back, and in the firelight some blood had come back into her face, and her hazel eyes followed him now with wariness still, but with something under the wariness that had not been there before. He ladled broth into a wooden bowl and crouched down to the child's level, holding it out. "It's not too hot. I tried it. Careful and slow. It'll put the fire back in you quicker than anything." Posy looked to her mother. Eloan nodded. The child took the bowl in both small hands and drank, and the warmth of it moved through her visibly, and she made a small sound of pure contentment that moved the corner of Silas's mouth in something almost a smile, the first that had troubled his grave face all that long night. "Doll wants some," Posy announced with the sudden gravity of the very young, and tipped the bowl toward the rag doll's stitched mouth. "Reckon she's cold too," Silas agreed, as solemn as if they discussed the weather. "You warm her up good. There's plenty." He rose and filled a second bowl and held it out to Eloan, angling it so her fingers closed on the far rim and their hands did not touch. "Thank you," she said, and there was a great deal folded into those 2 small words. For all of it. For going back down. Most men wouldn't have come out at all. Most men were dry and warm and asleep and never heard your lantern. I did. That's the whole of it. No thanks owed for a thing any Christian soul would have done. He took up the poker and set the logs settling. "You live up here alone," she said. "Bramble and me." At his name the hound thumped his tail. "Cut every log, split every shake for the roof. I cut timber, mostly, go down to the settlement twice a year for what I can't make or grow." Didn't always live this way. She had the hard-won instinct not to press a man on the thing he had just set carefully down, and he was grateful for it, and the not pressing was its own kind of trust given back. Bramble had shifted his old bones to lay his gray muzzle across her wool-wrapped feet, and the girl's small hand had come down to rest in the loose skin at the back of the old dog's neck, and there the two of them drowsed, guardian and guarded, while the fire threw its moving light across them both. But in here, in the small circle of yellow light, something else was happening, slow as sap rising, and neither of them named it, and neither of them yet dared to look at it straight. But it was there, growing between them by the hearth as surely as the warmth was growing back into the mother's tired hands. Not the dead silence of the mountains at their coldest, but a living quiet, threaded through with the drip of water off the eaves and the far softened roar of the flood loosening its grip on the land. Somewhere in the dark the storm had broken. He had not gone to his bed. Something turned over in her chest at the sight of it. She had known men who took up all the room in a house just by breathing, men whose kindness always came with a hook set somewhere in it, and she had spent the last 2 years bracing for the hook that never in this long night had come. Bramble lifted his graying muzzle and thumped his tail twice against the floorboards, and the sound woke Silas. He came awake the way she imagined he did everything, without startle or fuss, his gray eyes simply opening and finding her across the dim room, and for a moment neither said anything at all. "Storm's past," he said finally, his voice rough with sleep and gentle for all its roughness. "You hear it? Water's going down." "I hear it," she whispered, so as not to wake the child. He rose, slow and quiet, easing his weight off the sleeping dog, and crossed to the stove to feed it from the woodbox. Warmth bloomed back into the room along with the good smell of coffee as he set the blackened pot to heat. He worked without looking at her, giving her the privacy to sit up and gather herself and smooth Posy's hair back from her sleeping face. When the light had come up enough to see by, he took his coat and his hat and told her quietly that he was going down to look at the crossing. She wrapped the threadbare blue shawl about her shoulders and followed him out onto the porch, and there she stopped, one hand rising to her mouth at what the dawn had uncovered. The world had been scoured. Where the black water had roared and swallowed the road there was now only the wide brown wound of the creek, running fast and muddy but fallen back within its banks, and everywhere along the bottomland lay the wreckage of the night, branches stripped white, a fence rail driven end first into the mud, a drowned tangle of brush hung high in the willows to show how far the flood had climbed, and there, canted in the shallows at the washed-out ford, sat her wagon. It was mud caught to the axle, the bed slewed sideways where the current had shoved it, but it was whole. It had not been carried off and broken to matchwood as she had lain awake fearing. It sat there battered and filthy and stubbornly entire, and the sight of that homely familiar thing, all that was left of the life she had been driving away from, undid something in her, and she pressed the back of her hand hard against her lips and would not let herself weep in front of the man. Silas gave her the moment. He went down the slope in his long, unhurried stride, the hound picking a careful path behind him, and waded out into the cold shallows to put his hands on the wagon and learn its hurts. She watched him crouch by the front axle, reach into the muck and feel along the timber, his face settling into the plain concentration of a man reading damage with his fingers. When he straightened, he called up to her that the axle was cracked clean through, likely when the wheel dropped into the scour hole, and that she'd not have gone another mile on it before it failed her on some worse stretch of road with no cabin in sight. "Can it be mended?" she asked, coming down to the water's edge with Posy now at her hip, the child having woken and padded out after her, red cap askew, ragdoll trailing from one fist. "It can," Silas said. He looked up at the two of them standing there in the raw new light, mud to their ankles and their whole world sitting broke in the creek behind him, and something in his scarred face gentled. "I've timber seasoned in the shed and tools enough. Give me the day and I'll set you a new axle better than the one that broke. You'll not travel today regardless. Road's a bog for 10 miles either way, and the ford won't be safe to cross till tomorrow's sun has been on it." She began, out of long habit, to speak of payment. She had a little money sewn into the hem of her other dress. Not much, but she could not take a stranger's timber and a stranger's whole day of labor and offer nothing. And he stopped her, not sharply, with a small shake of his head and a look that asked her not to spoil the thing between them by naming a price on it. "I'll take no money from you. A man doesn't charge for pulling folks out of a river. If you want to be useful, there's eggs wanting gathering and a stove wanting tending. And that girl there looks like she could keep a hound company. That'll be payment enough and more." So the day took its shape. Silas hauled the wagon out of the shallows with a chain and a patience that would not be hurried, easing it up the bank a hand's width at a time, and set it on level ground by the shed. Then he stripped to his shirt sleeves in the cold and got to work. And Aloan, watching from the porch with a cup of his coffee warm between her hands, saw the whole slow craft of the thing unfold. He chose his timber the way another man might choose a horse, sighting down each length for the true grain, rejecting two before he found the one he wanted. He worked it with draw-knife and plane, the pale curls of wood falling away and catching in his beard, shaping the new axle by eye and feel, and testing it again and again against the old iron until it satisfied him. Posy, who had been a shy and clinging shadow since the terror of the crossing, thawed by degrees over the course of that morning. It began with the hound. Bramble had appointed himself her guardian, and where the child went the old dog followed at his stiff arthritic amble, and by mid-morning she had lost her fear of him entirely, and was combing burrs from his coat with her small fingers and telling him long solemn stories that had no ends. From the dog she came, cautiously, to the man. She drifted nearer and nearer to where Silas worked, until she was standing at his elbow, and when at last she asked him what he was making, he crouched right down to her height, this great scarred creature of a man folding himself down small, and answered her as gravely as if she'd been the county judge. "I'm making your wagon a new leg. The old one broke in the water. See here, this is the bone of it. When it's mended, you and your mama can ride on home." Posy considered this with terrible seriousness. Then she held out her rag doll, whose own stuffed leg had come half unstitched, dangling by a thread. Bess broke her leg too, and Aloan, watching, saw the woodsman take the shabby little doll into his enormous weathered hands as carefully as if it were made of glass, and turn it over, and study the torn seam with exactly the same frowning attention he'd given the axle. So she has. "Well, we'll not leave Bess lame while we're doctoring the wagon. I've a needle in the house and thread that'll hold. What do you say we fix her leg first?" They fixed the doll first. Aloan sat on the porch step with her cold coffee forgotten, and watched a man whose hands could split a cord of oak, thread a needle by the window light, and stitch a child's rag doll back together, his tongue between his teeth. The little girl leaning against his knee and watching every pass of the needle as if it were the raising of Lazarus. When it was done, he gave the doll a small experimental jiggle to prove the leg would hold, and Posy took it back and hugged it fiercely, and looked up at the scarred man with a shining, unguarded adoration that no one had taught her to feel, and no one could have made her hide. It was then, Aloan thought afterward, that she knew, not in the flood, when he had come for them out of the killing dark with the water at his chest. That had been the mercy of a moment, and moments could lie. It was in the long, ordinary daylight after, in the wood curls in his beard and the needle in his blunt fingers and the grave courtesy he showed a 5-year-old's broken toy, that she saw the whole of the man and found nothing in him she needed to fear. The scar down his cheek had frightened her at first. God forgive her. She had let herself read cruelty into it the way the world had taught her to. Now she looked at it and saw only that here was a man who had been hurt, and had not let the hurt turn him hard, which was the rarest thing she knew of, rarer than gold. The axle was set by late afternoon. Silas fitted the wheels back on and greased the hubs and stood the wagon square on its own 4 feet again, sounder than it had been before the flood. He said as much, wiping his hands on a rag, telling her the road would be passable by morning, and the ford safe to cross once the sun had dried it, that she could be on her way at first light with a wagon that would carry her wherever she was bound. And there fell between them a silence that neither seemed to know how to fill. For the truth was that Eloan did not know where she was bound. She had been driving away from a rented room in a town that held nothing for her but her husband's grave and her husband's debts, away toward a half-imagined cousin 3 counties north who might or might not take them in, driving into the mountains in the storm because staying still had come to feel like drowning by inches. She had not been going toward anything. She had only been going. And now she stood in the yard of a cabin a stranger had built with his own hands, with her child asleep against the flank of his old dog and her mended wagon, waiting to carry her back out into a world that had never once, until last night, shown her a kindness it did not mean to charge her for. It was Posy who said the thing none of the grown people could. She had woken from her nap and come to lean against her mother's skirts, and she looked up at Silas standing there in the low gold light with his tools in his hands, and she asked him, simply, the way children ask the enormous questions, "Do we have to go?" Silas went still. Aloan saw his throat work. He looked down at the child and then, with what plainly cost him something, up at the mother, and she watched him choose his words with the same care he chose his timber. "That's not for me to say, little one," he told Posy, but he was looking at Eloan when he said it. "Your mama knows where you're needed." He drew a slow breath. "But I'll say this much, and then I'll say no more about it, for I'd not want either of you to feel there was any weight leaned on you. This porch is a quiet place, and it's a safe one, and it's been a long while empty. If it happened that you'd nowhere pressing to be, if it happened you wanted a spell to rest and mend and study on what comes next, with no hurry to it and nothing owing, then you'd be welcome here, both of you, for as long as you'd care to stay, and not 1 hour longer than you wished." He set his tools down against the wagon wheel as if to free his empty hands of any bargaining. "That's all. The offer's there. It's yours to take up or leave, and I'll think no less of you whichever way you choose." It was the most he had said all day, and it had cost him more than the day's labor. She looked at him standing there braced for her refusal, this big, careful man who had waded into a flood for strangers and would not so much as lean the weight of his own hope against her, and she thought of the 2 years behind her, and the empty road ahead, and the way her daughter's hand had crept into that scarred fist that afternoon as if it had found the one safe place in all the wide, hard world. "We've nowhere pressing to be," she said. The words came out quiet, but they came out steady. She saw the thing move across his face that a less careful man would have let loose as a shout, relief, and a wonder he plainly hadn't let himself feel. And under it a loneliness so old and long-born that she understood, seeing it, that she had not been the only one drowning by inches up here in the high country. He had built this cabin board by board and lived in it alone with a dying fire and an old dog for company, and he had stopped, somewhere back down the years, even hoping to be otherwise. She knew that stopping. She had done it herself. A spell to rest, then, she said, and found she was smiling, and found her eyes were wet, and did not much care. And to study on what comes next, if the offer's truly there. It's there, he said low. It's yours. They did not say more than that. There was no need, and neither of them was made for saying more than the thing required. But Posey, who understood only that the good man's porch and the good old dog were not to be left behind after all, gave a whoop of pure 5-year-old joy and flung herself the length of the yard to bury her face in Bramble's neck. And the old hound bore it with his mild, ancient patience, tail going. And Silas laughed, a startled, rusty sound, as if the machinery of it had gone unused so long it had half forgotten the shape, and Aloan thought she had never in her life heard anything she wanted more to hear again. Evening came down soft over the mountains, washed clean by the storm. Silas built the fire up, and Aloan cooked at his stove as if she had cooked there 100 years, moving easy in the small warm room, and they ate together at the plank table with the child between them and the dog beneath. And it was, without any of them naming it so, the first meal of a family that had not existed the day before, and now, quietly, did. When Posey had been put to bed and the dishes seen to, Silas went out onto the porch as was his long habit, and Aloan came and stood beside him in the doorway. The clouds had torn open at last, and the whole cold, brilliant wash of mountain stars lay spilled across the black sky, more of them than she had names for, and the creek murmured its falling murmur down in the dark, gentler now, going quiet. The lantern still hung from the beam where it had hung all through the terror of the night before, the same lantern she had swung above her head in the flood, screaming into the storm for a help she had not believed would come. He had trimmed its wick and filled it fresh that evening out of old habit, and its small flame burned steady and gold in the still air, throwing its warm ring out over the porch boards and the sleeping hound and the two of them standing quiet at the rail. It had been a signal of distress, that light, a last desperate flare thrown up into the dark by a drowning woman who had run clean out of everything but the swinging of a lantern. And now it hung over a porch grown warm, over a mended wagon and a mended doll and a mended thing that had no name yet, but was surely there between them, glowing not for rescue any longer, but simply because the dark was wide, and the house beneath it was, at last, a home. A broken family and a solitary man had both, on the same black storm night, been carried up out of the flood and set down safe on higher ground, and neither of them, looking out at the vast and quieting mountains, felt any longer alone. Silas said nothing. He only reached up, after a while, and touched the warm glass of the lantern with one weathered finger, as a man might touch something he'd stopped believing he would ever be allowed to keep. And Aloan drew the threadbare blue shawl a little closer, and stood beside him in its light, and stayed.